Reactive training systems.
So another question that we got on the RTS Instagram is, how do you maintain a peak if you have peaked too early?
Maintaining a peak is difficult, but it's something that you need to do from time to time. Ideally, you would arrange your development cycles so that you peak on time, but that's not always possible. And especially with the additional stresses that come with maybe making weight or just the additional psychological stresses as you approach a competition, sometimes athletes find themselves peaking a bit too early. If you're peaking just a little bit too early, then you can use a traditional taper, and that helps to stretch that peak out for another week. And that's kind of my go-to in that scenario, you know, if it's like a competition type of scenario. And what I mean by a traditional taper week is, you know, where when you're 5 to 6 days out, you take your openers. When you're 3 to 4 days out, you maybe go through your warm-ups. And there's different permutations of this style. You know, some have a bit more volume, some have a bit less. And at that point, it really depends on the work capacity of the athlete and how volume sensitive they are. Some people really lose capacity, lose strength quickly when there's a reduction in the workload. If they're accustomed to a stress of 20 and then all of a sudden they've got a stress of 3, that's not enough. And if you're very volume sensitive, you may see a drop in strength. Since you're trying to maintain a peak, that's useful to know, and you would want to administer a taper that's got an appropriate level of stress. Outside of that, if you need to maintain a peak for longer, let's say a competition pops up at the last second and the best course of action for you is to do a development cycle and then maintain that peak for, let's say, like 3 weeks going into the competition, that's tough. And it's far from being a science. But the way that I've done it in the past is you make significant changes to the development cycle structure, but not all at once. So what I mean is, let's take a squat, just as an example. And let's say that you've got the competition exercise, the primary assistance exercise, and a supplemental movement. So maybe your competition squat for a single at 8 RPE followed by 85% back off work. And your assistance movement is pin squats for triples at 9 RPE, and your supplemental movement is Bulgarian split squats for sets of 8 at a 9 RPE. So let's say that that's the squat program. What you would want to do is something that Derek has called terracing. You'll want to swap out one of these units at a time for each of the weeks. So the first unit that you'll want to swap out is the competition exercise. Now, you can't change the exercise, but maybe you go from single at 8 followed by 85% back off work. Maybe you go to single at 8 with 90% back off work or 80% back off work. Or you may want to change it outside of this 10% ring that we find as being pretty similar in terms of stress response. So that could be one thing that you do is change that to single at 8 RPE followed by 75% back off work. Then the pin squats and the Bulgarian split squats remain the same. Then in the following week, you keep the competition exercise the same. Now it's 75% back off work. And you also change the second movement. So you go from pin squats to pause squats or box squats or something else. You can keep the protocol the same in that instance, but you don't necessarily have to. You just want to change that stimulus, and then the Bulgarian split squats stay the same. And then in the third week of maintenance, you're still doing your 75% back off work, and now your 2-count pause squats, and then you would swap out the Bulgarian split squats as well. And if you need to maintain your peak further, you start this process over again. I have found rare instances where you need to maintain a peak past 3 weeks. If you do, it gets pretty dodgy past that point. Theoretically, it should be possible, but I haven't had a lot of practice with it or success, to be honest. And I usually find that it's better to reorient the development block rather than just try to maintain the peak. Most of the time when I find myself having to use maintenance approaches, it tends to be last minute competition date changes, which are really frustrating to deal with. But again, if we're talking about outside of 3 weeks, it's oftentimes more beneficial to just reorient the entire development block.
Reactive training systems.